right, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Malloy Industries Masterclass on Data-Driven DEI, led by Sir Grease. Um, the Malloy Industries Consulting Group helps growth stage company executives build remote consulting teams so they can reclaim their time and freedom while scaling their business from 2 million to 22 million. Our clients can collaborate with over 120 vetted, trustworthy fractional executives so they can achieve business objectives, reach investor milestones, and reclaim their valuable time to focus on what matters most. If you're curious to learn more, I'll drop my email and a link to our website in the chat. So, the Malloy Industries Masterclass series leverages our experts' decades of experience to teach you practical and applicable skills in free virtual 30 to 60-minute Zoom workshops every week. And we're so excited for today's masterclass with Sir Treese. Today, you will get practical guidance on what DEI data can look like and how to measure it to build a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. So thank you everyone for coming and welcome, Sir Treese.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, excited to lead this masterclass for you all. I am going to share my screen and we can get started. I have a lot of material that I'm going to go through. There's going to be a little interaction. So be prepared to use the chat function or the reaction buttons, and then it'll probably take about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for some Q&A and discussion, discussion at the end. So that being said, let me go ahead and share my screen. And give me just a head nod. Can you see that, Chloe?
Yes.
Yep. Perfect. All right. So let me also get my notes pulled up here. All right, so again, like I said, I'm going to be using, let me also open this so I can see your responses. We're going to be using the reactions and the chat. So just as like a soft lead-in, curious, have any of you ever heard any of these comments? So I'm going to read a few and just go ahead and react if you've heard any of them. What is the ROI on DEI? Another favorite of mine is everything's fine. We don't have a diversity problem, right? We don't really talk about this. Everything's fine in our organization. Yep, see, I saw some thumbs up come in there. Another one is that DEI can't be measured because it's just feelings, right? It's all subjective. There's no hard data involved. And then one of my other favorites is, well, we already collect engagement data, so we don't need to talk about DEI data. It's in there, right? So go ahead. Yeah, I'm seeing some reactions come in. You've heard at least one of these, right? These comments come up a lot. And so hopefully by the end of our conversation today, you'll have some tools in your pocket that you can lean on when you hear these comments come up. So that being said, before we dive into the content too much, I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. So I am co-owner and chief consulting officer of Mattingly Solutions. We are a women-owned diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm. My business partner, our CEO, Victoria Mattingly, and myself, we have our backgrounds in industrial organizational psychology, which is the science of human behavior in the workplace. And that's why we love data and take a data-driven approach to DEI. We also co-wrote a book that came out in March of this year called Inclusalytics, How Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leaders Use Data to Drive Their Work. So if you don't get enough today, definitely be sure to hop on Amazon and check that book out because it has a lot of interesting information and a workbook that goes along to help you start your data-driven approach to DEI. And then just for fun, I am also a dog mom to Winston. He loves to jump up on that bed behind me whenever I'm presenting and steal the show. So I'm sure you'll get a glimpse of him or hear him bark at some point today. So enough about me. I want to get started by talking about the why behind diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, as I said, I love data. There was a study done with HR professionals, and it found that the most common barrier to increasing the effectiveness of DEI initiatives in organizations was actually a lack of metrics to identify insufficient DEI. So they didn't have the data to know where they were lagging. And then if you also look at I keep looking this way, my monitor's there. If you look at the two notes below that, those are related to data as well. So the next highest one is a lack of understanding of the potential benefits of DEI, and then also insufficient prioritization at top leadership levels. And if you had the appropriate data that would tell you how your efforts are impacting and giving benefits around DEI, and also it helps show leadership why it's so important if you had metrics behind that. So you can see how this all starts to come together, but how it can also be a bit of the chicken or the egg, right? Do you get the data first, or do you have this information first? So I want to poke into that a little bit more around the why. And I'm sure a lot of you are already here. You're probably already sold on the why DEI part if you chose to call into this call, but it's still useful to know why people think it's important, why there's value. And having a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive company has a lot of benefits. Research has shown things like, well, and of course, aside from it being the right thing to do, it does have importance from a business perspective. And so research has shown that more diverse, equitable, and inclusive companies outperform their competitors, and they improve the employee experience, right? So your employees are having a better experience. That's also going to mean they're going to stay with you. And so that's reducing costs related to turnover or low engagement. It's also going to increase how they can perform. So around things like innovation or creativity and what they're producing, decision making, how things are getting done, and all of these things together are then going to impact your bottom line, right? It's going to impact the profitability. So you've maybe heard people talk about the moral case of DEI or the business case of DEI. And the key here is that there's a little bit of both. So when we're looking at higher on the list, it's going to help people. This is a people first space, right? And that's what matters. And that's what we should care about. But because it's impacting our people and our organizations are made up of people, it is also going to, in the end, impact the business in some way. And that's how that all begins to tie together. Now, that being said, you may have heard some of this research. Go ahead and give me a reaction if you've heard any of these benefits before for DEI. I'm going to keep an eye out. Give me a thumbs up. Yep, seeing some things come in, right? This gets talked about a lot. But you may know there's a very popular study. It's done by McKinsey, and it kind of points out some of these things, but there's also been research that can't replicate these findings, right? And they're not sure. Maybe these benefits aren't there like we think. And that is why your own measurement is so important. Because while research has shown these benefits show up in some ways in different places, the best way to know the impact in your own space is to measure, is to figure out, do these benefits happen and what is leading to the benefits? And so your data collection process is going to tell you where to focus with your efforts, and then also where to pivot if it's not having the impact that you want. And so that plan, it starts with a baseline assessment, figuring out, where are you starting? What's your starting point in relationship to how diverse, equitable, and inclusive you are? And then from there, building out a strategy, right? You figured out where you are, you develop your purpose, your why, what do you want to see happen? And you can build a strategy around that to help you get there. And then continuous measurement. So you have to track your progress along the way to related to your goals in your impact measurements, right? Are we having that impact? Or do we need to change our approach? And then the other one is going to tie into that question I mentioned first, right? The ROI of your DEI efforts. So there is research out there if you need that as a starting point to get the door open. But then once you start doing things in your own space, you can measure and figure out specifically what your ROI in your organization is in relation to DEI. So that is a bit at a high level about the why of DEI and measurement. But for me, in doing this work as an external consultant, there are a lot of perceived risks that come up, especially from senior leaders. And so I wanted to touch on those some as well. And so here, I'm just going to go through the concerns first, and then we're going to dig a little deeper into each of them. So one of the ones I hear a lot is that DEI work is divisive, right? It's more about pulling people apart than getting them together, and we want to avoid that. And then, pull this over here. And so and yes, you can definitely feel free to shoot me chats. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat screen as well. So the divisiveness among communities, another one that is really interesting to me and comes up a lot, very common, are legal repercussions. And so that concern of, if we look at this data, we're going to be sued. that's the end of it. And then another one here is not being able to capture enough data. So we'll dig into that one a little bit more. And then that it's more about just calling out problems and focusing on the negative and not actually digging into solutions. So I'm going to go back through these a little bit slower and touch on the solutions you can use when these concerns come up. So on the first one, divisiveness. The key here is that we are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion at a high level. If I said this was a talk on colonialism or anti-racism or heteronormativity, right? That is very specific. And we are going to focus on those historically disadvantaged groups and bringing them the needs that, or covering the needs that they have. But if we're talking about DEI, that's designed to listen to the voice of all employees, right? That is there to figure out what's just in general, how is everyone coming along? What are even your underrepresented groups? And so it's important here to listen to the voice of everyone. And yes, that includes your old white men, right? That tends to be the group that we get worried about leaving behind. Well, they're a part of diversity. So we have to hear those voices as well. And so just being mindful of that when you're presenting your DEI methods, and also when you're collecting your information, making sure you have ways to hear everyone's voice. Another one here is on that legal side. So this is one of my favorite ones to talk about because it tends to be the largest concern. I should make this first on my list because it does I think I hear this one the most. And on the one hand, the recommendation here is that it's not a secret, right? Your employees can look around, they can see how many people are members of your organization, and diversity is about representation, right? So they can look and get an idea of if that representation is there or not. And so looking at the numbers isn't really going to change anything in that sense. It's just going to confirm it. It can also have the opposite effect. I've worked with clients before where employees are assuming that they're not having representation in some places, but the data actually is showing the opposite, and that the representation is there and people just aren't aware of it because they don't have access to that data. So getting the data can actually correct people's perceptions of what you have going on in the first place. So it's really useful. Now, the other piece that I like to talk about here, and I always give the caveat, I'm not a lawyer. This is not official legal advice, but at a very high level, based on the things I've studied around disparate impact, for better or for worse, the law is really on an organization side. And so as long as, let's say you look at your data, you see there's some inequities, if an organization is showing that they are putting in meaningful effort to correct those inequities, the law is going to be more supportive of them, and the person will either not have a case or at a minimum have less of a case than if you didn't have that data and you could support and see how in the data to actually show what you're doing to correct those inequities. And so two key pieces there, right, is one, you have to actually have the follow through, you have to actually act. You can't just collect the data and say, yep, we have some inequity here, too bad, and move on. You have to actually work to correct those issues that you find. But then two, the very data that you're afraid to collect is the data that you would need to support yourself, right? And so here it's all about, do you want to have to be reactive to a situation, or would you rather be proactive and get ahead of things and prevent those lawsuits from even happening? And lastly, I will just say, I don't think I said this clearly yet. I've talked to people in this space. I know a lot of other DEI practitioners in this space. And as far as I know, anecdotally, once you start looking at data, lawsuits don't just magically start appearing. Your employees actually tend to be happier when they see, oh, wow, they're committing to this, they're following through on their promises, and they're actually acting, versus when nothing's happening, then your employees are upset, right? They're like, they're not taking this serious, they're not seeing this follow through, and that's when those lawsuits tend to really show up. Again, that's just an anecdotal response to that one. So the next here we have around capturing enough data. And this tends to happen when you're doing things and you're trying to get your employee perception or hear their voice and get them to respond. And maybe they're not responding how you'd like. And this tends to tie back to there being fear that, one, there's no point in supplying their data, or two, they're fearful of what will happen if they supply their data. And so what helps here is transparency and communication. So being transparent with what you want that data for and what's going to happen with it, and communicating along the way. And also being sure that it's anonymous, right? So saying, yep, we're going to collect this data. These are the people who are going to have access. This is how it's going to be used. This is how it's going to be shared. And it's going to take time to build that trust. If you're coming from a place where your employees do not trust you yet, then it's going to take a little time. The same way, if you think about in your personal life, how you build relationships with people, takes a little time, right? You don't just walk up to someone and all of a sudden completely have faith in them and what they're doing. You'd see how they behave and how they show that you can trust them. And so organizations need to take that as well. So building that trust is a bit of a long game. You do your first round of data collection, you're really transparent and you communicate the plan for the data. Once you have the data, you talk about the actions related to it. And once people can see, okay, yeah, they mean business, this is being used appropriately, no one's being retaliated against based on their responses, all of a sudden over time, you start seeing those response rates increase and people really taking part. So that one takes just a little bit more time to build. And related to, I mentioned this in the last two spaces, but it is about action. It's really important that once you have your data, you are tying it to action. Because it can't just be about identifying your solutions, or sorry, identifying your problems. It has to be about the solutions. And it's not just about identifying problems, right? Your data will also show you your strengths that you can use to build on those areas of opportunity, right? So how are you using those strengths as your solutions as well? So that was a quick hit on some of the perceived risks. And I do know sometimes I go a little fast. You'll have access to these slides. I'll make sure and get that sent over to Chloe and that can be shared out as needed. So you can go back through any of this and we can follow up in the Q&A as well. But these are some of the typically perceived risks. But I want to talk a little bit more about some overlooked risks as well. So these would be things that I see as someone who works in data a lot, that I get worried about if I see this happening in an organization. So one, seems silly, but not collecting data at all, right? I go into places, I talk to different organizations or people in organizations and find out that they're not looking at data in any way. And as we just said, the measurement matters. It tells you where to focus, it tells you when to pivot. So if you don't have data, then you're going to be behind the ball. Similarly, only collecting one type of data. So not having any data at all is rare. At a minimum, most organizations start with just their EEOC data, right? So that's related specifically to diversity. And those are just your, again, it's EEOC, so it's very limited even in that, right? But you have at least some representation data as a starting point. But the picture is so much bigger than that. So making sure you take a robust view, and we'll dig into that one a little bit more on the next slide. Another one, only looking at a high level. So I've mentioned getting the employee voice, right? So doing survey work, and an error that I see here happen a lot is just collecting your data and looking at your results and thinking, yep, we got, a 95% on people feel valued, respected, seen, and heard here. And you're at a high level and you think things are good, but you forget to break it down by your different identity groups. And this is all identity groups, right? And so you're missing those nuances. So I'll talk about one client I have, for instance. We looked at their data at a high level. Okay, seems fine. But then when we broke it down, for them, it was actually by location. We saw that their Tennessee plant was looking a little different, right? Their scores were a lot lower. So now it's like, all right, there's something happening in that environment that's very different than everywhere else. And people are experiencing the workplace a lot different. And it wasn't based on some of those other identities that they were concerned about and thought they'd see differences. So all of this to say, it's important to take that double click down into your data. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second as well. Now, we talked about the one end of not having enough data. then I see people who get stuck in the trap of too much data that they don't know what to do. And so progress just stops moving. And if you've heard the phrase analysis paralysis, it's one of my favorites. And that's what that's referring to. You've done all these analyses and now you're like, oh my gosh, I have all this data. What does any of it mean? How does it come together? And the key here to prevent analysis paralysis is just at the beginning, before you even start collecting your data, make sure that you have a clear purpose, a clear why. Why are we collecting this data? What is the question we want to answer? What is the problem we want to solve? And then from there, you can figure out what data is going to be most useful to help you do that. And that'll help you then kind of focus in as you continue on, because it can be very easy to just keep collecting data. But it's important to just know why you're collecting that data in the first place, and it'll help you move. And then here, no continuous measurement. So this one I see happen a lot with surveys as well, is maybe collecting data once and then 3 years later. It sounds silly, but it happens a lot. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. You can help me with that, Chloe. And so 3 years later, looking at your data.
So it's like very clearly
gray. Oh, there you go. I think we found it. Thank you. So 3 years later, looking at your data, right? At this point, that original data set you had is so out of date that it's not helpful to make any comparisons, right? You've lost all of the opportunity to leverage that data. So being sure that you're checking in more often so you can see what progress is being made. And next one here, last one on this slide, is just not asking for help. So on the one hand, it's not knowing what internal resources you have. Maybe you have a people analytics team that you can lean on. Maybe there's other departments that are doing similar work, and so you're not realizing that there's some duplication of efforts going on. Or maybe you don't have people internally where data is their expertise, but you're afraid to go external, right? You're afraid to open that door and ask for help. Or maybe you don't have the resources to do that. And so my comment here is just, you don't have to do it all alone. A lot of the stuff isn't as easy as it seems at a high level, and data can be overwhelming. And it can actually do more harm than good when it's not done well. So don't be afraid to ask for help. Go out there and get support, whether that is internal support that you have available, or if you need to partner with an external partner. So that was a lot about the why of DEI and data and how that can look. But I want to dig deeper into some of those points I alluded to around the what. So we're going to do this a little more interactive here as well, just kind of get a feel for what people have seen and what people use. The first piece is with diversity. So diversity is how we see each other, right? And by see, it can be visible or invisible, but diversity is where it's all about representation. This is when it is a numbers game. And so here you can look at your workforce demographics. You likely have this in your HRIS already. Maybe you have your EEOC data that we talked about. And looking at that again at multiple different levels, so different identities, and then looking at that in different ways. Excuse me. So just a show of hands here, who collects some form of representation data currently? Or if you work with clients, like you see that come up with your clients? Go ahead and give me a thumbs up reaction there. Yeah, seeing a couple come in. Diversity data is where a lot of organizations tend to start, and that's because they already have that, or they have reporting that's mandatory. And if you haven't started, if you are one of those companies who don't have any data, this is an easy way to just kind of slide into that data collection process, because you have it in some way, maybe you're just not reporting it already. The next one here is around equity. So equity is how we elevate those who have historically been left behind, right? As an organization, what are you doing for those underrepresented groups to help them be able to proceed in an organization? And so when we think of equity, people in measurement, people tend to default to pay equity analysis, which is really important and definitely a key part here. But it's also important to look at other policies, practices, procedures in your organization and how it's impacting people from different groups. So we are going to tie that representation data that we have into our review of these different policies, practices, and procedures. So doing a full organizational audit, right? This policy exists. How are different people in different groups using it? Is it impacting people differently? A great example I like to use here is like a lot of places will have a HIPO pool, right? Your high potential employees. Looking at that by demographic, that's going to show you some of this equity piece in there, right? So just being sure that you're taking a full, complete view when measuring your equity and not just that pay analysis piece, because that's just a fraction of the puzzle. Anyone I'm going to do a check here. Anyone give me a thumbs up if you're currently doing any kind of equity analyses in your organization. Could be pay or any of the other ones that I talked about. Yeah, seeing some hands up go up there. Awesome, but a few less. Yep, that's what I thought. All right, so then the next one I want to talk about is inclusion. So inclusion is what you do. Inclusion is a behavior and it's one-on-one. So equity was what is the organization doing from a systemic level, whereas inclusion is what are the individuals in your organization doing. And since it's behavior, the way we measure that is best with other report data. So if you ask a survey, for instance, and I'm going to pick on Chloe again, she's my go-to example name today. So let's say we ask Chloe, and the question says, I feel like I'm an inclusive leader. Well, honestly, I don't care if Chloe thinks she's an inclusive leader, right? I care about the people who interact with her. Do her direct reports think she's an inclusive leader? And so instead, a better question would be, my manager is an inclusive leader, or my manager uses inclusive language. And you can even turn that into a frequency scale instead of strongly agree to disagree to get more robust data collection. So I could go on and on about writing a good survey question. But the point is, when it comes to inclusion, making sure that you're getting other report data. You're asking people who would be receiving those behaviors if they're seeing those things happen. Another piece here that's really cool is there are so many other ways to collect observational data that are really powerful. One process that's really interesting is organizational network analysis. So in this analysis, it's able to show you how people are connected. And so there's all these little bubbles and you can see which bubbles are connected, and the bubbles represent people. And sometimes have people who are connected to others in so many ways. And then others, you have people who are siloed off in a corner by themselves, right? So that's starting to show you, okay, what's happening here? How are those strong connections being made? Can we leverage that in other places? What can we do to bring these people off who are siloed off in a corner, right? And so organizational network analysis is another really interesting example, but there's a lot of cool tech being developed every day to help us get some observational data about how relationships are being built in our organizations. Now, I mentioned earlier that not everything about DEI is fluffy and feelings, but when it comes to belonging, that is the fluffy part, right? That is when people feel valued, respected, seen, and heard. And so the only way to get at that is to get sentiment data. So this is your self-report data. And so you just got to ask people. That's the only way to find out if people are feeling good. You just got to ask them how they are feeling. And so this is where your surveys are going to come in as well, and getting that self-report information on how people are experiencing the workplace. And while it is a bit subjective, that doesn't make it less valuable. It's important to know how our employees are feeling because, again, this is people work at its core. And the best way to know how to help people and help improve how they're feeling is to ask those people. Instead of going out and reading something or just copying what your competitors are doing, just ask your employees what they need, because sometimes we think it's one thing and then we spend time and resources on that and it's not what they needed. And so now you have to continue efforts in other ways, and you're doing more work than if you had just spoke to them in the first place. So that is a bit about the what, and then very closely related here would be, oh, actually, I forgot one of my interactions. So actually this time, I want you to drop in the comments. I mentioned the cool, inclusive, behavior, other report data. If you collect any inclusion data, similar to how I mentioned like organizational network analysis or any other cool processes that people may not be aware of, feel free to drop it in the comments. I love when we can knowledge share. So go ahead and drop a comment if there's an interesting type of data you collect that we didn't talk about today. And it can be related to any of these 4 categories, but I'll let you drop those in as we continue on. So the next piece here is the how of DEI and data, very closely related to the what. We're going to talk about those pieces again as we go as well. On the first piece, it's your quantitative, right? So a lot of what I talked about did involve numbers. So your demographics, that's your representation. So that's, as we said, that's a numbers. Those are a numbers game. It's percentages. And then the next piece was that equity data. You can get numbers related to that as well, right? Are you seeing trends in your promotions, in your selection numbers, in your recruitment, in your hypo pool, in the policies you're using? So again, you can look at some percentages there. And then the frequency of inclusive behaviors, we talked about that model, right? And then lastly, those feelings of belonging. You can, because it's a survey and we have it scaled, you can give it a numeric value. So we collect all of this quantitative piece, but it's also really important to make sure you're getting qualitative. So interviews, if you're a small organization, quantitative data only has but so much power. So one-on-one interviews can be really useful. Also, interviews are used a lot at hearing from your executive team, hearing from your senior leaders, what they want, what they're expecting to help you build out that why that we talked about, your purpose around DEI. And then the next layer there is focus groups, right? So you've collected all your quantitative and that tells you what's going on, but we like to say the qualitative tells you why. So you can do that double click in and use that quantitative data in those focus groups. Hey, you know, we collected this data, we were seeing these percentages, but numbers can mean a lot of things. We wanted to hear from you why you think these numbers may be coming out these ways and what we might need to consider. So really using those focus groups to take your data to the next level. But similarly, if you want to hear from all employees and getting focus groups can be hard, it's just making sure you're having ways for employees to submit open-ended feedback, whether that's an open-ended comment on a survey or you know some other methods where they can just supply written feedback to you to consider. So you have your quantitative and you have your qualitative, and once you have it all together, the important part is to look deep into your findings. And so that's doing that double click that I mentioned. So one, don't only look at the org level, look at your data by identity. I've mentioned that a few times today, but also make sure you're looking intersectionally. Excuse me. So you look at that one level by one identity, start combining identities as well. You can also combine, I alluded to this too with the equity, is not just combining identities, but also combining it to employee life cycle can be really powerful and help paint a picture. Because a lot of times we do start to see things change as an employee moves through their life cycle. And being sure you're looking across different data sources as well. So again, we talked about how you collect your diversity data, your equity and your inclusion, your belonging, seeing how that story paints a picture. Toss in your performance metrics as well, right? Toss in your turnover. Look at all of those things together. And be sure you're looking at these by across all levels of the organization, as I mentioned. And the most important part, right here at the bottom, we talked about this earlier as well, and that is using your insights to develop your actions. Be sure that you are tying those actions back to your original why. Helps paint your whole story, that combine that, pull that whole picture together. This was our why. This is the data we collected. This is the story, or this is, sorry, these are the insights we found. And now here are the actions we're going to do in relation to that and how it all comes together. That being said, that's a nice transition into connecting DEI data to action. So this is what we're going to talk about to wrap up, just digging into that a little bit more. So the first piece, of course, we did our data collection, we did our analyzation, and the first piece there then would be establishing that action plan that I mentioned. So being sure to tie that action plan back to your strategic goals, and not only your DEI strategic goals, but your overall organization strategic goals. This also helps with getting that divisive piece when we talked about in the perceived risk, right? And getting people on board. If you think back to the very first slide, that activity we did around everything's fine, right? We don't need to collect this. If you tie this conversation back into your core values, mission, purpose as an organization, and use those words with your senior leaders, that's going to help get their support as you move forward, right? Because you can say, hey, this is what we said we want our organization to be. This is what we're currently seeing happen in our organization. So we're not meeting that mission, that goal, that value that we said is important to us. And here are the ways we can be doing that, or here are the things we can be doing to help us get there. So being sure you tie that all together is really just an important piece of that storytelling bit. And that gets us into the communication piece. And this is one of the most important pieces, right? That transparent communication. It's crucial that you share your results out, because that's going to help build that trust and also help you with accountability. So when sharing out results, it's common to do this in a phased rollout method. And the order I typically see this go in is starting with those executives, because they get a first look, so they can help champion this as you move forward. It also shows like that commitment from the organization when your executives are signing off on things. And it's important to make sure their questions are answered right away, because you'd hate to go out and say, hey, this is the data, here's the things we want to do, and then senior leadership comes back and shuts you down, right? They're like, we didn't know about this, we're not in line with this, we're not ready to go. So it is important to start with them up front and get them on board and ready to help champion things as you continue your rollout. And so then the next, and this can typically be in a presentation of some sort, right? The next piece then would be, if you're a bigger organization, letting your other senior leaders and managers know, right? Who would those employees go to first with questions? If it's not those senior leaders, then it would probably be good to have that middle step happen again. So when employees do find out things and they ask questions, those managers and leaders have the answers they need and they're ready to have those conversations. So again, this could be a meeting. It could also be providing them with a specific report if you have the data available at their department level or anything like that, maybe function level, something along those lines. And then after that, we can then make sure we roll it out to everyone else in the workforce. So that way, at this point, every internal person has seen this data. They know what the big takeaways are, and they know what the actions are that are happening as a result of those takeaways. And this goes for all kinds of data. It's not just an employee survey, right? It's any other analyses. It's the equity analyses you're doing. It's the representation data you're looking at. It's just being really transparent with your whole process here. Now, when it comes to sharing with your workforce, they don't need a full meeting necessarily, right, to review the results. A lot of times people will make like an infographic, something short and sweet, just covering those highlights, because that's what they really care about, not quite as much deep in the details. But something that I do like to recommend is doing a town hall, right? So you give them some kind of visual of the data, they have a quick summary, but giving one more opportunity for them to give their input and their feedback. So do a town hall, make sure everyone's invited. It's optional, they can attend if they want, but at this point, they can ask questions about the data, they can ask questions about the process, about the next steps. They can give recommendations on what they think is useful. And it's another chance for you to show your voice matters and we're listening. So that's something that I think can be really useful. Last thing around communication, this one's a lot, right? Last thing around communication, if you're feeling, really brave and you want to be at the forefront of the industry, would be then sharing your findings externally as well. So we talked a lot about the internal side, but then hold yourself accountable. Let people know out of your organization, hey, we know these are where, we're falling a little short. These are the places where we're doing pretty well. And here's how we're going to use those strengths to build on our opportunities and some of the steps we've already put in place to get us there, right? So something transparent, but again, robust and straightforward enough that they can get a full picture. This is going to help you with your customers or your clients. It's going to help you with prospective employees, and it's also going to help you with stakeholders, right? And then again, overall, it's helping you with accountability, because now that you've publicly said, hey, these are the things that are going on and this is our commitment, it's going to help push you to actually follow through on those commitments, which is the last piece of the triangle here, or the arrow here, and that's following through. So once you've done all of your communicating, just remembering to follow through on what you said would happen. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a client or talked to a prospect and they're like, yeah, we made this plan 5 years ago, and we've talked about things, or we've slowly started things, or we just finished this one thing, and all of the other things were kind of they just sat on a shelf for a while, and they didn't get there was no commitment, there was no follow through. So just being sure that you remind yourself, time flies, right? I think about that all the time. I remember when I was a kid and I felt like time just kind of lagged on, and it took forever to get to the next thing. No, time flies when you're an adult and in the workplace. And so just remember to actually hold yourself accountable to keep pushing forward. And something that helps here is having a person or a department, if possible, dedicated to overseeing these things. DEI, of course, is integrated into every part of your organization, but it is useful to have a DEI manager, leader, CDO who can just say, are we having these conversations, right? Like, these are the things we promised. Is this department doing this? And is that department doing that? And making sure that the things are happening everywhere. So one last thing I want to show, just as an example of how this process can look. This is just a simple case study example. So here at Mattingly Solutions, we have our Mattingly Inclusion and Belonging Assessment, which is a process we go through. And the first piece are those executive interviews I mentioned, right? So doing those interviews with some execs to gain buy-in and alignment among those key stakeholders. We get to hear their voice, figure out what they're picturing, where they want to go. It also makes them feel heard. They feel like they're a part of this process. And so that's a really important way to start off and build a strong connection, especially for us as external consultants, but also would be valuable if you were doing this all on your own internally. And then something we love to do, again, just giving employees a chance to have their voice heard and to build that trust, is starting the survey process with a live kickoff session. So before we send out a survey link, we do a live 30-minute call. People can come if they want, and we just reiterate what's going to happen, what the data is for, what that process will look like, and give them the chance to ask questions. And now they know, okay, this is why this email is coming to me from this person. And then from there, it's actually just collecting the data. And so in our survey, it collects that some behavioral data, sentiment data, but it also gives us some demographics, because a lot of times organizations, they only have a couple of those identity questions and they want to say they're diverse in different ways, but they just don't have access to the data. So it gives the employees a chance to self-report here. And then we wrap up based on the findings in the pre-survey. We do some targeted focus groups to explore those groups that were scoring lower and those pain points that we were finding, get some more context there with that qualitative piece that I mentioned. So based on that, we then take all that data and create that, what we call our DEIX roadmap, which is a 12-month plan. And that 12-month plan, it focuses on maybe three to four areas, and then breaking that out into about 10 actions, right? So trying to make something targeted, short-term enough that you're gonna keep yourself moving forward, and then you can revisit. And again, being agile, pivoting as needed. And after that, you can finally dive into those behavior change interventions, which is where everyone likes to start. So now that we've collected data, we made a plan, now you can build your employee resource groups or do your unconscious bias training or your pay equity analysis, whatever you've realized you've been missing so far. And then a year later, starting the process over, redoing that survey, seeing where things have changed, and then revisiting your roadmap. What needs to continue? What needs to shift? And then, and so on and so on. So that is just a quick example of how a process could look, but your process may look a little different depending on the size of the company you are or where you are on your journey. the last page here, I'm just going to click through really briefly. It's more so there just as a cheat sheet for you later on. But we talked about establishing the why behind DEI and data, figuring out your specific why as well, and then defining your sources of data. So what are you looking at and how are you going to do that? How are you going to collect that data? Being sure to follow through your data collection with an action plan and transparently communicating that action plan out. Measuring as you go for that impact, that ROI on DEI, being sure you collect that data. And the big piece I always like to drive home is just do not try and do it all on your own. It is a lot, it's overwhelming. And so just lean into that partnership, again, whether that's internal or external. And so before I open it up for discussion, I am going to, give me one second, I did not have this prepared. And now it's not working for me. Okay, so because I love data so much, I also just love to know how people experience workshops that I do. So there's a short little, speaking of surveys, there's a short survey that I dropped in there. There are like 4 questions. So if you have a moment and are open to taking that, I just dropped it in chat, but that's what it is. So thanks for having me. I'm also going to move us into Q&A. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So if you come off, want to come on camera, I can see your faces, but definitely feel free at this point to raise your hand or drop a question in chat and we can revisit anything I went through today. Or if coming in here, you were hoping to have one question answered that hasn't been answered, let me know and I'm happy to chat about that. We'll give everyone a minute to think about what questions you might have. And again, you can come off mute, raise your hand and verbally say your question, or feel free to drop that in chat and we'll keep an eye on that as well. Nope. There's Winston making his appearance. I will say, just looking at chat, saw a comment from Dane earlier who had said they include communications data through text analysis, who's communicating with who, and they use sentiment and content analysis as well that give them a temp check while also building with surveys and direct questionnaires and feedback. Thanks for sharing that, Dane. That's really useful. When you collect qualitative data, content analysis is really useful. Thematic analysis or content coding is something that gets used a lot. And so with that, it's really useful because when you collect data, or sorry, qualitative data, you get a lot of information, right? Especially when it's written. And so being able to categorize that into different buckets is something that will help you then be able to talk about it in a summarized form versus having to continuously quote. And it helps you then kind of quantify your qualitative as well, because you can say, you know, X% of comments were related to this topic. So there's a lot of power there. I will say with sentiment analysis, that's something that's really popular and people like to have, you know, oh, our comments were positive or our comments were more negative. And sentiment analysis is something that's a lot harder to do. If you think about how we speak as humans and how we tend to even write, we're not always that black and white, right? Like it's not just this or that. Sometimes the things we say may be a little positive and a little negative, or maybe it's sarcastic. And so especially those automated methods of looking for sentiment can be really difficult to be accurate. And so I always caution a little bit when you use that sentiment analysis, just to be a little cautious with how you're interpreting it and how much weight you're putting behind the amount of positive sentiment you get or negative sentiment, because it's a really complex thing to try to navigate. So definitely think the best first step is that content or thematic analysis. Yeah, sentiment analysis is definitely a tricky one. Awesome. we'll give it one more minute. Any other, I know really what's happening right now, you're all completing my little feedback survey, so you can't ask the questions, right? But we'll give it one more minute. If there's any other questions or thoughts, also take any, anything you want to share that came to mind that you're doing already that you think would be useful for others to consider. Happy to hear that as well. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, I just want to echo Dane and Nira as well. This was a wonderful and fantastic presentation today. So thank you for that. I think it was very insightful and very informative.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And again, I'll get the copy of those slides over so people can definitely use that as a resource. Or again, if you want some more information, be sure and check out the book or the workbook attached to that. It can be really useful. And if you want to follow up, again, I get real excited about these things, that sometimes I talk a little fast. I appreciate the shout out on that. So if you want to dig deeper into anything, feel free to reach out and we can have a follow-up conversation. Can't tell I love talking about this, so happy to talk offline, but also happy to give you a little bit of time back in your day so we can wrap up a little early today. Chloe, I'll pass it to you with any closing comments.
Yeah, so thank you for today's masterclass yet again. As I mentioned before, the masterclass series leverages our experts' decades of experience, and we have a series of more free virtual Zoom workshops every week. So if you would like to learn more, I will drop a link in the chat, and I will be sending a follow-up email to all of you with an overview of our class today, including a recording and the slides from Certrice. And thank you again. Thank you, everyone.